The curtains on the farmhouse windows were all calico patterns. It was oddly disconcerting. Fitting for a 150-year-old farmhouse, I suppose, but it didn't match what I knew about my targets at all. I tried to find that node, that calm space I'd trained so many to find, but it just wasn't there. I'd waited so long for this moment, for this peace, that I just couldn't settle down and enjoy the process. Lying in the tall, dry grass, with a gentle breeze to cover any motions I might make, should have been settling, calming. I was in a perfect position, perfectly comfortable. It would have been nice to have a spotter along, but other than that, everything felt flawless, except that I couldn't settle into the calm. My mind flickered over the reason I was in that tall grass, and an overwhelming wave of loss surged over me. I couldn't even remember Gabby's laugh anymore. I was sure I could remember it just a couple of weeks ago, but it was all fading. Even Trisha's smile. Maybe I was the only one who remembered them at all. Sometimes I thought if I could just get some sleep, some real sleep, I might get it all back. The front door opened, and a lone figure stepped out onto the broad wooden porch. She was elegant, even in faded, stained blue jeans and an oversized, worn man's Carhartt farm jacket, one of the tan canvas ones. The wind toyed with her long silver hair for a moment, until she pushed it back behind her ears with a curiously girlish impatience. I hadn't expected her to be at the house yet. She and the others were all due to arrive in an hour or two from a Thanksgiving vacation. She glanced around for a moment, then looked up, right at me. I could see her clear blue eyes through my scope as they settled on my position. I tried to tell myself it was a fluke, but it was soon very clear, all too clear. She knew. She couldn't see me, but she knew I was there. She seemed to resign herself and began to walk slowly toward my hummock. It was a long walk, almost 700 meters by my scope, through the slowly waving sea of grass, and I watched her pick her way through it. She'd left the jacket unzipped, and I could see she wasn't wearing a vest, just a flannel shirt. That was probably deliberate. The breeze caught her every now and then, and she'd clutch the tan canvas jacket closed reflexively for a few seconds to shield herself from the chill of the late November day, then let it go to hang open just as reflexively. She wanted me to see she had no weapon, no vest. A vest wouldn't have helped against the heavy rifle trained on her anyway, but it was clear she wanted to talk and didn't want me to feel threatened. I scanned around me. There simply wasn't anyone else. I had a clear view across the rolling fields in practical range, and except for this one, all of them had been cut for hay late in the summer, leaving them almost bare. My puzzlement and curiosity had allowed her to get to the bottom of the small hill, and I watched her pause there. She carefully stepped over a dry creek where a sometimes rivulet had dug a shallow trench. Her light blue boots were traced with colorful embroidery and sparkled with rhinestones, strangely at odds with her practical, worn farm clothes. As she picked her way up the low hillock, I rolled up into a sitting position, leaving the rifle to rest, and drew my revolver. It's pretty old school. Nobody carries a revolver anymore. But this one was special. The Colt Pythons had always been among the finest revolvers ever made. They were works of art, and I'd always wanted to have mine with me at the end, and this was probably it. I pushed the hood of my ghillie suit back and pulled the mask down. She glanced at me with a polite, distant smile and a nod, then sat down a few feet away, wrapping her arms around her knees and looking it out over the farmhouse. We sat there for what felt like an eternity. "They won't be coming, you know. It's just me." Her voice was cultured, finishing school perfect, but almost lyrical despite the training. "I figured that." We sat in silence for another eternity, just watching the grass sway like ocean waves until the wind kicked up a bit, as if it needed to do something to fill the void. "I have coffee down at the house if you want some." She was so calm and centered, I suddenly felt like a kid playing soldier. I holstered my revolver, stood up, and picked up the rifle, folding the bipod as I slung it behind me. She sat, slightly huddled in the oversized jacket, looking up at me with impossibly blue eyes. I reached down to help her to her feet. She took my hand and rose as gracefully and graciously as she seemed to do everything. It was hard to believe that this was the demon who had killed my family, the demon I had hunted for so long and sold so much of my soul to reach. We walked carefully down the small hill. She grasped my forearm to help herself over the small, dry cut at the bottom, as if it were perfectly natural to do that. I had a moment of concern as we stepped into the house, but it was empty. A battered military saber hung over the fireplace beneath a painting of some mostly forgotten 17th century battle. "We can sit in the kitchen or take a service to the parlor." "The kitchen would be fine." I leaned the rifle in the corner of the huge kitchen. The rubberized pad on the butt of the big M24A3 sniper rifle wouldn't let it slip and fall, and I always had the python if anyone showed up unexpectedly. I'd only need one bullet for her anyway. Now that the rest of the targets were out of reach, I didn't really care what happened after that. She hung her jacket on a set of hooks near the side door out of the kitchen, and I hung my ghillie poncho next to it, then sat on one of the high stools at the tall, rough-cut table. No point in being uncivilized. She carefully poured rich black coffee into a couple of honest-to-God John Deere tractor mugs. I'd always figured her for fine bone china, but she seemed perfectly content with these as she slid onto a stool opposite me. She didn't bother to put out cream or sugar. She sipped a bit and closed her eyes for a second to enjoy it. It was damn good coffee. "Do you prefer Ken or Kenneth, or should I call you Colonel Howard?" "Ken is fine." I paused awkwardly, a bit off my game. "And you?" "It's usually Evelyn, but I'd rather be called Evie here if you don't mind." I glanced around at the dried peppers and garlic hanging in strings along door frames and off cabinets. Evie did seem more appropriate here. "So, how did you know?" "Maria contacted us last night. She's been watching you since the incident in Macau, the one with all those poor girls." I caught myself before I responded to that. She'd been at least partly responsible for what happened to all those poor girls. As for Maria, Deputy Director Maria Hawthorne of the FBI, I was hoping I hadn't caught her attention. Hope is not, as they say, a course of action. It was all I had, though. I couldn't be certain either way, and digging to find out would almost certainly have drawn her attention. Depending on how deeply involved she was, there might be an HRT parked in the basement right now. Actually, even if she wasn't involved, there might be a team waiting. Not that it could possibly reach Evie in time. She continued, "She was trying to figure out your angle, why an organization like yours would even be interested, and why you'd want to be in on that raid. She appreciated the help, but she started wondering about the why after a while. I needed the papers, shipping manifests, the contact lists, everything. She and her people were so tied up with getting all those girls to safe places. My guys on the ground had plenty of time to photograph all that. She guessed that. She said a couple of people disappeared before she got to them." I nodded. I needed more answers. Evie sipped a bit more of her coffee. "She finally figured it out and guessed what you were planning on doing today. She had Homeland tracking your travel. They saw the plane ticket to BWI. I'd left too many clues over the years. It was impossible to avoid. I'd had to take chances, take risks to get the information I needed, and had the bad luck to trigger the interest of one of the few people who could have figured it all out. I didn't understand why Hawthorne hadn't simply had me rolled up. If she'd figured out this much, she had to have known I wouldn't be a risk to her agents. Who told you I'd be on that hill?" "Maria's friend, Michael, said it was the only sane place a real sniper would choose. He seemed to know more about your organization than anyone else." She paused. "Given your reasons for this, I asked Maria to let me handle it." I closed my eyes against a surge of unwanted, nightmarish images. She drove on, unknowing. I asked her not to interfere, just to keep Emma and her family out of it. She didn't like it, but she honored my request. Personal promises mean a lot to her. She really cares about Emma. Sometimes I think Maria is more her mother than I am." Her voice faded at the last of that, reflective, saddened. I wasn't sure what she intended. Maybe she sought pity, maybe nothing. It didn't matter. Nothing could help her in my eyes. If she'd failed as a mother somehow, it was her choice. At least her daughter was alive. I hadn't had a choice. I'd have given anything to get Trisha and Gabby back, to be a husband and father again. All I'd ever wanted was to be the best dad ever, but I'd settle for vengeance. If it was all I could have, then I'd take vengeance. She looked down for a moment, studying the floor. Your plan won't work. You can't hurt him through us. I know why you want to, but he simply doesn't care about us at all. Not that way. We never emotionally mattered to him, and we really ceased to matter once he understood that Emma would rather die than be involved with him. With Reinhardt IG, my death might even make things easier for him. She closed her eyes and held up her hand. Sorry, that sounded kind of pathetic. I'm not trying to dodge responsibility or the consequences. My name, my family name, was on those companies, on those bank transfers. They were my responsibility, and I just wasn't looking. It's inexcusable, really. I'd wondered if it was something like that. The pattern of death stretched much further back on his side, Reinhardt IG, than hers, but she was right. It was inexcusable. Unforgivable might be a better word. Emma and her family have a right to be out of this. She isn't part of it. If she's not working for him, why has she infiltrated the FBI? She looked genuinely shocked at that. Oh, I never thought how that would look. She gazed into her coffee for a second, watching the steam scud across the black surface, then swirl up and off. She didn't infiltrate the FBI. That's where she was hiding. From him, from us, really, where the money couldn't really reach her. She hated us, hated the money, hated the power. I don't think she'll ever completely forgive me for how she was raised, what we did to try to prepare her. She gave a wry smile. I'm lucky she lets me into the children's lives at all. She gestured down at her clothes. She thinks this is some kind of penance for me, like sackcloth and ashes. I raised an eyebrow. It isn't? Everything I've found makes it pretty clear that denim and flannel aren't exactly what you're used to. She shook her head, an honest smile lighting her face. Not what I'm used to, but I've found out it's what I want. Everything else seems so superficial. I soaked that in. It all rang true. I've been lied to by the best, at their most desperate. Not for very long, and never twice. If it was all true, and if I did survive this, I would have to figure out another way to hurt him. She took my silence as a signal to keep talking. She shouldn't have. It very nearly killed her. I'm sorry about Patricia and Gabriella. Stop! I stood, slamming my hand on the table. An eruption, an almost uncontrollable surge of hate and anger welling up. Screams echoed in my head, the screams of my wife and little girl. Images of wreckage floating on the ocean flashed through my mind. There had been a throwaway comment in a news story that the passengers were probably conscious for all of the 10 minutes it took the struggling airliner to finally make impact after the bomb had gone off. It was burned permanently into my brain, and it ripped into my sanity again. I had a vivid image of Trisha huddled protectively over Gabby, waiting, praying for the salvation that wouldn't come. She flinched, stunned, then stayed very, very still. You don't get to say sorry about them. You don't get to do that. Not about Trisha and Gabby. For a second, I felt the checkered wood grips of the python against my fingertips. She faced me, raising her chin slightly, as if giving me permission. She didn't look angry or scared. She just looked resigned. It took all my strength to pull my hand from the grips. Even she, as composed as she was, breathed a small sigh of relief at that. I forced myself to sit back down, the screams in my mind fading slowly. We just sat, rigidly staring across the table past each other. She spoke first. Certainly couldn't fault her for courage. Apologizing was a reflex, Ken. I don't expect you to accept it or even acknowledge it. You're right. For some things, there is no forgiveness. I closed my eyes for a second and breathed deep, the rich coffee scent calming me a little. She started again. The woman was relentless. It took me a long time to figure out even some of what was happening, and even longer to accept that Eric was that inhuman. Even when Maria explained it, I had trouble believing it, because it meant I helped him, enabled him, even if I didn't know it. Inhuman was an excellent word. Somewhere along the way, the Reinhardt of Reinhardt Innersingemeinschaft, Reinhardt IG, had realized that the stock markets could be manipulated with a few small engineered incidents. The massive conglomerate that was Reinhardt IG was so large that different companies could exploit sudden changes in the stock market from different angles. A fire in an oil refinery, a mechanical failure at a pharmaceutical plant, an ethnic uprising in Africa, or the terrorist bombing of an airliner. After I'd worked my way into position as the head of a special mission unit that had always been more rumor than reality, I first used it to exterminate the terrorist group that had been tagged with the crime, only to discover they were mere puppets, but I still had that unit. The convenient thing about a black unit is that nobody looks too closely at it. Nobody wants to really know what it's doing, as long as certain lines aren't crossed. Because what you don't know, you won't have to testify to in front of Congress. Once I'd confirmed the existence of the unit, I did everything necessary to become what was needed to lead it. Then it had found me. I'd reshaped the unit to suit my needs. The unit still filled the niche it already had, but it grew more capabilities I needed, and I used those capabilities to pursue my agenda. If anyone ever figured out what I'd done, I'd likely be in prison for the rest of my life. Kidnapping, extortion, illegal surveillance, theft on a particularly grand scale. The extrajudicial executions alone would ensure my permanent incarceration, although every one of those killed deserved it. I wouldn't have innocent blood on my hands. I'm pretty sure I couldn't be accused of treason, although that admittedly depended on who defined it. I recruited carefully. When the unit needed a new senior non-commissioned officer, I recruited Sergeant Major Godek. It always struck me as odd that we actually became good friends. He's pretty much the only one I'd had in the last 3 decades. I hadn't sought him out solely for his obvious abilities, but because it gave me an informal link into the Cumulus programs through his sister Donna. Ironically, it ended up allowing me to keep an eye on Emma Reinhardt and her progress at the FBI when Emma had married a Cumulus operative. I had settled on an eye for the Reinhardt. He'd lose his wife and daughter, too, before I killed him. It had taken me a while to track down Emma Reinhardt, and when I did, I found out that a terrorist cell in Turkey had nearly beaten me to her. Ironic, no other word for it. She interrupted my reverie. The only things he cares about are money and power. If you kill me, he'll suffer a little when the stock market fluctuates. I can't really offer more than that. She left it at that, standing up to refill both our cups without saying a word. I assume Maria looked into my background? Did she tell you what I did before I applied for OCS and joined Special Forces? She said something. Enlisted, I think, a sergeant or something. I was in finance, a numbers guy. I enlisted to pay for my degree in accounting. That's how I know your death won't really hurt him. She shook her head, then frowned pensively. It'd be temporary. He'd recover everything and then some in just a few weeks. Reinhardt might even make money off it. Big companies, financial institutions, can make money off good news or bad news. I felt a grim smile start as a thought struck me. If you live or die, Reinhardt will be fine. They'll still make money, as long as they know. I sipped the last of my coffee. It's uncertainty, the not knowing that they can't handle. I allowed Evie to write a note to her daughter, reminding her that Maria had promised not to interfere in any capacity. When I told her to find some clothes to take with her, she was confused at first, unsure if I was really going to let her live. I don't have any clothes here. They're at my house. She gestured toward the east where I knew a small cottage sat. No, find something here. She pulled out a box from the closet, filled with tie-dye skirts, blouses, t-shirts, shoes, and beads. It was obviously a spare bedroom. I must have looked baffled, and she just gave a sort of odd smile and said, Monica left these when Kat took that fellowship in England. It'll be another 6 months before she misses them. Tie-dye should be banned. Believe me, nobody who knows me and sees me in this will believe it's me. From what I'd learned of Evelyn Cabot, that was probably true. I selected a pair of jeans with rainbow-colored peace signs on the back pockets, a mostly bright blue tie-dye blouse, a pair of little cloth dock shoes, and a heavily beaded denim jacket, tossing them on the bed. Strip to your underwear and throw the clothes over there in the corner. She shrugged and began to pull off a boot. I'm not wearing underwear. If she thought I was willing to accept risk to save her modesty, she had another thing coming. I'm not leering. I just need to be sure you don't have any weapons. Or radios or phones or whatever. She shot me a look from under her sculptured eyebrows as she took off her second boot. I don't get a lot of leers these days, but you should have seen me 20 years ago. She peeled her jeans off, then pulled her flannel shirt off over her head and pirouetted slowly, arms raised like a ballerina. Her slender form had aged extremely well. She was still certainly worthy of a few leers. She didn't have any weapons either. That's fine. You can get dressed. The only thing she seemed to regret was leaving her fancy boots behind. So, what now? I led her across the fields. It was a bit of a walk to the sedan I'd borrowed, but it wasn't entirely unpleasant. The wind was warming just a bit. Once in the sedan, she sat quietly, gazing at the passing farmland as we headed south. I explained to her that if she caused me any trouble at all, someone would go back for her daughter and grandchildren. I might not be able to hurt the Reinhardt that way, but I could hurt her. She sank into her seat a bit, but nodded her agreement. I needed to switch vehicles, but I'd made arrangements. They just needed adjusting. It was nearly 140 miles to Needle's salvage yard. He'd been a team medic once upon a time, and I'd shielded him as much as I could from the fallout of a pill habit he'd fallen into after an ugly divorce. I'd made arrangements with him for the car we were in. He'd drop it into a car crusher as soon as we left. I'd also left my bags with him before heading up to the farm. He opened the door as we pulled up. His mustache had exploded to the point it was almost taking over his face under his faded Coors Light fishing hat. He looked puzzled when Evie got out of the car on the other side, but he knew better than to ask questions. It wasn't the payment he'd gotten from me, although that was probably enough for any amount of inconvenience. It was that residual loyalty that comes with serving together. He just waved us into his office trailer. I need something we can live in for a few weeks, a van or a big car. Transportation just got a lot harder, and I need to give my travel agent a bit of time to work it. He pulled his hat off, scratched his balding head for a second, then glanced at Evie with a smirk. Got just the thing, boss. Papers are flawless. Nobody's looking for it, and damn, it's perfect. Wait here. Might be an hour. It was just about 50 minutes before he pulled it around front. We walked out to meet him, and I brought my stored bags with me. The engine purred beautifully, but that was about the extent of its charm. An aging, once mostly white RV, now adorned with deadhead stickers and a flowery hand-painted sign warning if the campers a rockin', don't come knockin' on the back. Fading murals of the 1978 Blue Rose Winterland poster covered its sides, and even the curtains inside appeared to be blue and black tie-dyed. Needles swung out of the driver's seat with a wide grin. It's in better shape than it looks. 1970 Ford Econoline 300 Shasta RV, Class C. Everything inside works great. Stove, toilet, shower, all in working order. It may be a bit outdated in style, but it's fully functional. Filled the water and charged the LP gas for you. Even topped off the tank. Got it for a steal at auction 6 months back. Been sitting in a barn for 20 years. Fired right up when I brought it out. He gestured proudly at the giant mural. I figured you and your lady friend could ride in style, or at least what she's accustomed to. I glanced over at Evie. At first, I thought she was crying, but then I realized she was fighting back laughter. We needed to move quickly before Needles learned something that could put him in danger. Still, anyone attempting to harm him would quickly discover that my medics were not to be underestimated. To be honest, a couple of aging hippies in a retro RV weren't likely to attract attention from anyone I was concerned about. You searched it? I asked. Yeah, Found a couple kilos of ancient weed stashed under the wheel well, but that's it. I didn't bother asking what he did with the weed. Not my problem anymore. Judging by his description, it was probably as potent as oregano by now. Evie glanced at me and then towards the side door of the RV, silently awaiting my approval. I nodded, signaling her to proceed. She knew the consequences of making any foolish moves. Opening the door, she hoisted herself inside with her bag of clothes, while Needles and I inspected the weathered vehicle from all angles. The tires seemed surprisingly sturdy, and the rest of the RV appeared functional, if not exactly luxurious. As I circled around to the rear, Evie slid open the back window. "Honey, it's perfect back here. Queen-size bed, plenty of room to stretch out, and, well, everything," she said in a sudden switch to a pure Southern Belle accent, complete with a teasing wink. Needles grinned. "See? Perfect." He paused, then added with a sly grin, "Let me get those spare keys for you two lovebirds." As Needles disappeared into his office, I glanced up at Evie. She offered a half smile. "Maggie the cat from Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. I minored in drama." Keeping watch on the office door, she leaned in closer. "He doesn't know anything, does he?" "Not much," I admitted, "just settling a few debts." Her expression tightened. "What if Eric's men find him?" "More than likely the Reinhardt loses a few men and Needles disappears." "Shouldn't you warn him?" "Just my presence here is warning enough. He's savvy." She looked uncertain, but I knew Needles was prepared. When we'd first entered his office, I caught sight of his hidden arsenal. At least 3 handguns, maybe a shotgun or carbine. The salvage yard might not be ideal for a rifle, but he likely had more weapons stashed around. Needles returned with a weathered surplus backpack, interrupting our conversation. "I cross-loaded a Unit 1 medical pack with extra antibiotics and meds in this," Needles said, handing over a weathered surplus backpack. "There's also a clean 1911 Gold Cup match with 4 mags and an extra 200 rounds in the bottom. I know you love that damn flintlock of yours, and it truly is a thing of beauty." He grinned broadly under his ridiculous mustache. "But Jesus, boss, 6 rounds, no rapid reload?" He knew my preferences well. I nodded gratefully. At least it wasn't a Glock. God, I hate those things. 30 minutes later, we were on the road heading south, and Evie seemed unnervingly relaxed. She had unearthed an old hardbound Crams Easy reference businessman's atlas from somewhere in the camper, and was absorbed in tracing out routes with a fingertip. Her nails were surprisingly short for someone with her background. "You know, I've never seen the Grand Canyon," she remarked casually. "I'm not sure you understand the whole kidnap victim thing," I replied dryly. She shrugged, undeterred, and continued studying the map. "You said this would take weeks, maybe months. There's no point in being miserable the whole time. I've already promised to see this through, so you don't have to worry about me. Besides, sooner or later Stockholm Syndrome should set in, right?" "That's fine, but this isn't a sightseeing tour, and I don't plan on going anywhere that snow might hang us up." I thought I detected a slight, secretive smile from her, but I couldn't be certain. Blue Highways, that was the book, by a guy named Least Heat Moon, a rambling account of the back roads of America. I had stumbled across a tattered copy while crossing the Pacific in a C-141 that felt like it wanted to come apart at the seams. Least Heat Moon had traversed thousands of miles via backroads and secondary highways. It had struck a chord with me. That was my blueprint. If a road boasted the label interstate, my aim was to steer clear of it whenever possible. Our route would take us south from Virginia to Florida, then westward on an irregular trajectory until I reached my travel agent. Evie, amused, arched an eyebrow. "So, are we stopping at all those quaint diners too? I've read the book, you know. I always wondered what it would be like to just go like he did. No destination, no deadlines, no pressure." I gave a non-committal shrug, keeping my eyes on the road. "I don't know. I've always had a destination, an endpoint." She fell silent after that. The only electronic gadget I carried was a completely pristine tablet, procured months ago at a random Walmart. I had never bothered to unbox it, let alone turn it on, until we halted at a McDonald's in Catawba County, North Carolina. There, I set up a Yahoo account and executed a buy it now for a $10 vintage friction drive toy plane on eBay. I opted for 2 planes and had them shipped together. By the time we finished our meals, well, at least I did, since it turned out Evie wasn't fond of McDonald's, I had a response. In 3 months, I could procure 2 planes of the same model, albeit at 3 times the original price. Evie observed the entire transaction in silence. Technically, it wasn't advisable to let your captive witness such activities, but I was confident she wouldn't jeopardize her grandchildren. I had seen the determination in her eyes whenever she spoke of them. Since this seems like an unusual purchase for collectibles, I assume it's related to our journey, she remarked. It's $30,000 for passage for 2 from California to Fiji, and it will take about 3 months. I have arrangements to continue from there to our final destination without encountering customs. May I ask where our final destination is? You may not. It's part of the whole kidnap victim protocol. I can cancel the Fiji leg if necessary. Oh, I suppose that makes sense, not wanting to be met by the police at the airport if I attempt to escape. I debated reiterating my warning, but it felt unnecessary. Yeah, exactly. In truth, I wasn't overly concerned about that scenario. Once we reached the islands, I was fairly certain that local law enforcement would be less than welcoming to FBI or Reinhardt interference. Chief Frank Ratuma owed me a few favors, and he had a strong aversion to outsiders throwing their weight around. The thought of law enforcement attempting an arrest at the shack, with Pogo, his wild wife, and Monster around amused me. They'd better send someone they didn't mind losing. Something amusing? Evie asked. A bit. Just thinking about the challenges law enforcement might face, I replied vaguely, opting not to elaborate. She seemed apprehensive that first night. We parked and settled down in a Walmart lot. Evie changed into a t-shirt and shorts in the camper's cramped bathroom. I sensed her preparing herself in case I had any expectations. All I expected was sleep. I hadn't slept well in over 30 years. Light sleeper was an understatement. I wasn't worried she would catch me off guard. I laid out a blanket and a pillow on Evie's side of the bed and did the same on mine. Concerned she might become uneasy, I decided to revisit a comment I had skipped earlier. Just a reminder, I have friends. Sooner or later, if something happens, they'll take care of your daughter and grandkids. I wasn't entirely certain about that, especially regarding the grandchildren. Monster had always been peculiar around children. If he viewed Emma Reinhardt as a threat, she was in serious danger, but her children might be spared. According to Finn, if his information was accurate, they were likely safe. Evie didn't need to know that. I made a promise. I'll keep it, she replied coldly, almost lawyer-like. That night she slept with her back turned to me, wrapped tightly in her blanket. I placed a line of pillows between us. The next morning she was almost excessively polite, likely realizing the gravity of our situation as the initial adrenaline wore off. Watching her prepare herself for the day, I contemplated the logistics for the next 3 months. We needed groceries, more clothes, soap, shampoo, another toothbrush, and various toiletries. We'll need to do some shopping. Groceries, some clothes, I stated. She glanced over at me. Can we pick up a hairbrush? Her hair had fallen back into near-perfect order with just a few strokes of her fingers. It seemed determined to maintain a graceful appearance. Sure, if you need makeup or anything else, we'll get it. It might not be exactly what you're used to, but it'll suffice. She brightened just a little. I don't need much in the way of makeup. Much seemed like a relative term to me. It had been so long since I'd lived with a woman that I'd forgotten how much makeup it took to achieve a natural look. Rather than causing a scene, it was easier to buy what she wanted, especially since it visibly improved her mood. All we ended up purchasing were the toiletries, makeup, and some underwear. We avoided making large cash purchases to avoid drawing attention to ourselves. We spread out our shopping across different towns, visiting a Goodwill store for cooking utensils and silverware, and another town's grocery store. At Goodwill, Evie found several more outfits, sticking with the aging Woodstock refugee theme. Frankly, she seemed to be enjoying the experience far more than was appropriate, still not fully grasping the dynamics of being a kidnapping victim. In public, she adopted a toned-down version of her southern accent and decided to go by the name Libby while referring to me as Kay. Once we had loaded her newfound treasures into the camper, I couldn't help but ask, "Libby?" "I get Kay. It's easy to remember and make sense. But why Libby?" "It's short for Liberty Moonflower. When I was a teenager, I decided that would have been my hippie name. Liberty Moonflower just sounds free. I would have worn tie-dye dresses, love beads." She held up her clunky rosewood bead necklace, one of the more modest pieces from Monica's collection, and had a fur-person companion named Spindrift. That sounded entirely too thought out and too earnest. The last part had been more to herself than to me. Glancing over out of the corner of my eye, I saw her gazing distantly out the window, lost in some kind of reverie. The bird in a gilded cage. We all yearn for what lies beyond the fence. For the poor, it's wealth. For her, it was freedom. Freedom from her life. Freedom from the responsibilities that had bound her. I let her sit quietly for a while until she began to emerge from her daydream. I pretended not to notice. "So exactly what the hell is a fur-person companion?" I finally asked. She smiled softly. "A dog, I think. Maybe a cat, but probably a dog. I never had a dog." The grocery store trip was another eye-opener. She had no clue about cooking whatsoever. Her entire life, she'd had others to handle such tasks. 30 years of bachelor living had made me a decent cook. In the rough corners of the Army, far from standard facilities, it wasn't just about shooting or fighting. Being able to cook something beyond ramen noodles or give a decent haircut mattered. She watched with frank puzzlement as I gathered basic ingredients. I could tell she had no idea what cooking oil was for, let alone why anyone would need both shortening and cooking oil. As we moved on, we tried to blend in. The best way to hide is to appear as something else. Other people in the campground simply saw a couple of ex-hippies taking a retirement tour in their old camper. Evie kept her promise to cooperate. Whenever we were outside the camper, she became Libby to all appearances. By the time we hit the panhandle of Florida, we'd settled into a routine. I drove for 4 or 5 hours each day, picking campgrounds that accepted cash, or finding a secluded spot in a Walmart parking lot. I tried to vary our routes as much as possible. Knowing humans aren't great at true randomness, but I did my best. We typically cooked breakfast and dinner in the camper. Well, I did most of the cooking. Lunch was our break on the road, and when it was Evie's turn to choose where to eat, she always picked local spots with unique specialties. Foot-high pies, emu dishes, gator stew, and anything deep-fried were on the menu. I wasn't sure how it had happened that she got turns in the first place. Most kidnapped victims don't get that luxury, but somehow it had evolved that way. She seemed to relish the unusual foods. Somewhere in Louisiana, I finally asked her about it. She smiled over her plate of alligator sausage jambalaya. "I grew up on French cuisine, calf's head, pancreas, escargot. I just enjoy trying food that's a little beyond McDonald's. You seem to handle it just fine, too." "Jungle survival school," I replied. "Living on grilled tarantulas, steamed patty bugs, and fried crickets burns any food aversions right out of you." She wrinkled her nose playfully. Her ability to shed her Swiss boarding school upbringing and act so normal intrigued me. Delicately spearing a bit of sausage, she mused, "A lobster is really just a giant water bug with good public relations, I guess." "Depends on whether you're the lobster," I quipped. "True," she agreed with a smile. She reached for another cayenne cornbread biscuit, generously slathering it with extra butter. "I'm glad to see a woman who eats with gusto," I remarked, unable to stifle my amusement. "I'll need to slow down soon. Before you snatched me, I was doing yoga and horseback riding every day. If I keep eating like this without exercise, I won't fit into Monica's clothes much longer. From what I'd observed, she didn't seem in any imminent danger of outgrowing her wardrobe. Honestly, I think you'll be just fine. With a sudden switch to her Southern Belle persona, she quipped, "While I do appreciate the compliment, kind sir, my ever-expanding derriere might beg to differ." I nearly choked on my alligator, trying not to laugh, but her infectious laughter soon had us both in stitches, tears streaming down our faces. It took us a good half hour on the road before we could regain enough composure to make eye contact without bursting into laughter again. She had her atlas out once more. "I'm not sure how important this is, but if we stay on course, we'll be in California in about 2 months." That concern had been nagging at me too. I wasn't worried about Hawthorne. If she had wanted to strike, she had ample opportunity back at the farmhouse. But I didn't want to become a sitting duck for the Reinhardt if he started actively searching. Before I could respond, she spoke softly, almost pleadingly. "I've never been to the Grand Canyon." Her words hung in the air, carrying a wistful longing. I sighed deeply. You really don't quite grasp the concept of being a kidnap victim, but I suppose it could kill some time. We should pick up a couple of heavy comforters at the next stop, and maybe some flannel pajamas. It can get damn cold there in winter. Somehow, at the next stop, alongside the comforters and pajamas, we ended up with a foot-tall, battery-powered Christmas tree clamped to our small dining table. After that, Evie seemed a bit distant, lost in her thoughts. She had been cooperative throughout, but the Grand Canyon clearly held a significant place in her heart. It seemed to symbolize something she had lost, or perhaps something she hoped to rediscover. She became quieter, almost shy. For several days we avoided serious topics, sticking to harmless chatter and trivial pursuits. Yet, despite the circumstances, things felt oddly comfortable. That is, until we detoured to Central Illinois for a hamburger. The place was called Moonshine Diner, and I couldn't even recall where we had heard of it. Supposedly, they served incredible burgers, and while they were indeed quite good, maybe not quite living up to all the hype, the challenge lay in navigating the labyrinth of country roads to find it. It was precisely the sort of aimless side trip that fit our cover story of being two hippies on a road trip, passing the time. The catch was arriving before 12:30 p.m., after which the grill would shut down, leaving only cold sandwiches. This necessitated spending the night at a nearly deserted campground, braving the harshness of Central Illinois winter. The relentless wind never ceased, whipping across the vast, open fields with nothing to impede its progress. No hills, no ridges, just endless expanses of bare land punctuated by sparse lines of trees. Even inside our camper, the sound and sensation of the wind managed to seep through. In the 1970 RV camper, every gust of wind seemed to shake its aging frame. We had already settled in for the night, as usual, facing away from each other with our respective comforters and a fortress of pillows between us. As the wind intensified, I heard her stir beside me. "I'm cold." Another powerful gust rattled the camper, prompting her to start rearranging the pillows to cocoon herself. The relentless wind continued to rock the camper. The chill deepened around us. After a moment, she sat up. "Ken, we're both adults, and you've been more than accommodating with my concerns. Maybe tonight we could just stack our comforters together and sleep back to back?" I agreed, and we settled in with her back snug against mine. The next morning presented a new challenge. We woke simultaneously, having somehow shifted during the night. I found myself on my back, arm draped around her, while she nestled against my side with one hand gripping my shirt. I couldn't fathom sleeping so deeply that I hadn't noticed our repositioning, but it was evident it had occurred. We untangled ourselves slowly, exchanging no words. From the bemused look on her face, she seemed as surprised as I was. She broke the silence with a wry comment. "I must be developing Stockholm Syndrome after all. If it's any consolation, I don't have any plans to rob any banks in the foreseeable future." She perched on the edge of the bed, eyeing me thoughtfully. "So, what's our plan?" Our plan. Stockholm Syndrome, remember? I regarded her for a moment, then decided there was no harm in sharing some details. You've never been the stay-at-home mom. Most of your responsibilities are on autopilot, but you do sit on important boards and cast significant votes. Even when Reinhardt is present, he can't vote for you. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in, as she nodded slowly. If you were to miss these meetings, what would happen? Sure, proxies could be picked up, but periodic proof of life complicates things. It injects uncertainty into decisions, delays long-term plans, and ultimately affects Reinhardt's bottom line. Over time, the cost could provoke a reaction. He won't come for you himself. He has people for that. People like you. Not exactly like me. They'll be after you, I clarified. Her eyes widened slightly at the realization. Perhaps she had started to see us as allies, maybe even developed a touch of Stockholm Syndrome. I shook my head, anticipating her response. He won't reach you. I'm choosing the battleground, and unless we make a serious misstep, he won't even know there's a battle until it's too late. So, I'm bait? Her voice carried a mix of disbelief and weariness. Initially, yes, but now I'm starting to think you could be more than that. An ally, maybe even a partner. She looked down thoughtfully. Are you planning to kill him? If everything goes according to plan, but first I want him to suffer, to feel a fraction of the pain he's caused so many. Without another word, she picked up her clothes and headed to the cramped bathroom to change. When she returned, I had already poured 2 cups of coffee. She stood silently, studying me for a long moment. If you want my cooperation, I have conditions. You still don't quite grasp the role of a kidnap victim, I reminded her. Her expression remained composed, reflecting the seasoned boardroom executive I had encountered before. I know ways to hurt him that you haven't even considered. I respected her directness. What do I get in return? Her clear blue eyes chilled. Emma and her family. He'll target them to get to me. If we proceed with this plan, I want them protected where he can't reach them. Moving them would draw too much attention, but I can arrange serious protection. Call in favors. If Hawthorne values her, she'll likely assist. If not, I can compel her. She didn't ask, but raised an eyebrow in silent inquiry. I have footage of her eliminating an official during the Macau raid. It was captured by one of my snipers. He deserved it, but legally it doesn't matter. He wasn't actively threatening her. I'd prefer not to use it, though. Blackmailing the deputy director of the FBI was a tactic best reserved for dire circumstances. No one reached that level by being easily intimidated, and the footage I possessed of Hawthorne's actions in Macau confirmed she wasn't one to flinch under pressure. If anything, she had likely only grown more hardened since then. Evie shook her head, her expression unreadable, as she reached for her coffee. Maria warned me you'd be ruthless. We moved over to the small table. I'll take that as a compliment from her. You're confident you can ensure their safety? She pressed. One of my former team members runs a private security firm. He owes me a favor. Kurt had handled numerous contracts from me after leaving the military to start his own company. He wouldn't hesitate to assist again. Katie, his partner, might have reservations, but she was pragmatic enough to see the necessity. Evie traced a pattern on the table beside the Christmas tree, contemplating her words carefully. Eric's Achilles' heel isn't just money. It's his pride. It's also what makes him dangerous. That's why I'm here, really. I raised an eyebrow. Really? I distinctly remember kidnapping you at gunpoint a few weeks ago. And if I hadn't already decided to talk to you, perhaps work with you, Maria would have dispatched a team. They might have apprehended you, or not. Michael mentioned your skill could have made it a risky endeavor. But either way, I wouldn't be here, yeah? Fair point. So, why now? My grandchildren, and Emma. Eric will eventually come after them, especially if anything happens to me. Emma stood up to him, did what no one else dared. She told him to go to hell and take his money with him. He's patient, but he doesn't forgive. Never has. He won't let that defiance go. And you've been their protector. I've done what I could, Until now, I could only shield them and wait for him to strike. Shields aren't the best weapons. Her gaze turned piercingly cold, and I anticipated her next words. I needed a sword. I rose from the table to refill our coffee, giving myself a moment to absorb Evie's revelation. It reshaped my perspective. Initially, I had assumed Evie saw me as a necessary evil, a lesser threat compared to the real monster she had been married to for decades. With Hawthorne's insights, however, she now grasped the true extent of his danger. Returning with our freshly filled cups, I settled back down. So, partners. A faint, grim smile touched her lips as she reached across the table, lightly gripping my hand. Partners. Ah, Farker. We moved on to seek out those special burgers we'd heard about, and then began our journey towards Dallas, where Kurt's security firm was based. A stop at McDonald's followed, much to Evie's quiet displeasure, though she understood the need for Wi-Fi access. I ordered us coffee and waited for a reply to my dinner invitation. It arrived promptly, tentatively positive, but with an uncharacteristic coldness that hinted Katie had penned it. Later that evening, as we settled in for the night, we ended up lying back to back again. Ken? Evie's voice broke the silence. Yeah, I replied. I didn't choose any of this. I was born into it. That's pretty much what I thought, I acknowledged. I wasn't like Emma. I wasn't strong enough to fight back. Did you want to, though? For a while, but it just seemed impossible to even begin. Tough life, I mused. Don't be condescending. I didn't get to choose anything. The one time I tried... Her voice trailed off. What happened? I was seeing a guy, Nick. He seemed perfect, until he disappeared. I thought my parents approved. He was a Yale-educated lawyer from a well-connected family. We were planning to hike the Grand Canyon, and he just didn't show up. That filled in that gap. She sighed. My father had a talk with his father, and they decided it would benefit both families if we parted ways. Eric's father had approached mine about a match, like some 17th century royal arrangement. My father made it clear it wasn't optional. You could have walked away from everything. I would have lost everything. It was never explicitly stated, but it was understood. Money, privilege, status. Like I said, I'm not Emma. She has Eric's willpower. I chuckled to myself. That's changed. I suppose it has, but it's a bit late. So, whatever happened to the other guy? He found someone else and married within 6 months, about 3 months before my family was joined with House Reinhardt. I guess I thought he'd pined for me for years. That killed any romantic notions about life I might have had. Ori. She fell silent for a moment, then nestled back against me a bit more firmly. I wanted it to be something it wasn't. You know, those old love stories where two people who have nothing in common are forced together and eventually fall in love. It started off just like that. We disliked each other on sight, but it never got better. Just not right for each other, huh? She laughed softly, sardonically. He only tolerates 2 types of women. The weak, submissive girls he can and does force into degrading things, and the toughest, crudest street girls he can find. They reinforce everything he already believes about women. Must have stung him to have a daughter. My second, unintentional act of defiance. My first had been refusing to take his family name. My third was denying him another child after he gave me gonorrhea. I can see how that would be a problem, but people get over infidelity all the time. Infidelity wasn't the issue. He never promised fidelity, and frankly, after meeting him, I didn't expect it of him. We lived separate lives. Our marriage was almost strictly a financial arrangement, but I agreed to 2 children. After the disease, I refused him another child. We'd had trouble conceiving, and I'd been tested over and over again. He never considered that he might be the problem. I paid, very dearly, for the privilege of viewing his medical records. Emma was almost literally a miracle. Are you certain she's really his? Fair question. I wasn't as bad as he was, but I had my share of discreet liaisons. Still, I was careful, and Eric had her tested to be sure. Trust was, for obvious reasons, in short supply. Any little Reinhardts running around? No, thank God. I've kept a very close eye on that. So, I'd guess that brings us to his third weakness. Money, pride, now his legacy. How did you know? Seriously? Hundreds of years of Reinhardt merchants growing Reinhardt International, a demand for 2 children. His fury over Emma. I don't need G2 to figure that out. Legacy is crucial to people like him. If Emma has completely rejected him, what can he do? I'm not sure. I know he started relying on the board to support him. The bloodline matters to him, though. He may have designs on Ellie. Her voice was controlled, steady, but beneath it lay a palpable fear, coiled like a venomous snake. It fell quiet after that, and I felt her slip into sleep behind me. She had voiced her fears, making them easier to confront. But my nightmares had taken a darker turn. I had nearly handed Reinhardt exactly what he desired. If I had gone through with killing Evelyn, Emma, and Emma's husband, it would have left Reinhardt as the guardian of the girls. They were innocents, and despite my threats, I doubted I could harm them. Without their parents, they would have been vulnerable, easily manipulated. He could have exploited their grief and anger to mold them into his image. 3 potential heirs, 3 Reinhardts under his influence. There was a high chance that one would succumb to his will. I needed to rethink my strategy. Prolonged suffering wasn't feasible. Too many variables. Too risky. He needed to experience pain, loss, and despair, but his life couldn't be spared. We never discussed it, but the pillow wall between us never returned. As we moved south to escape the cold, we shared a single blanket. I had no intention of driving the camper into Dallas. Maneuvering through city traffic and navigating the network of cameras, bank, store, traffic, was unappealing and risky. Instead, I arranged to meet Kurt at a steakhouse several miles outside the city. As expected, Katie joined him. Kurt had mentioned she handled the business side of the firm, and it was clear she harbored distrust towards me. I didn't blame her. She approached our table with Kurt, maintaining a carefully neutral expression. Kurt scanned the restaurant with a practiced eye before seating Katie across from Evie and taking his place beside her. It was a gesture that seemed almost old-fashioned for his generation, similar to how I had seated Evie earlier. "Colonel, I wasn't sure you'd show." I nodded towards Katie. Katie responded with a perfectly practiced smile. "Business is business." Practical, as I expected. Kurt's smile softened slightly. "How's Pogo?" "Married." Both Kurt and Katie were taken aback by that revelation. Pogo, Sergeant Major Godek, had been a lifelong bachelor. Katie looked genuinely shocked. "Seriously? Who would—" Kurt gently placed his hand over hers, cutting her off. "Katie." She leaned back in her chair, processing the news. It was clear she had some preconceptions about us that were being challenged. Maybe rightfully so, but Kurt was who he was, and we had found a way to work with that. Perhaps for too long. Evie observed the exchange with keen interest. Katie restarted the conversation. "So, who's the lucky girl?" "He met her on leave about 15 years ago," Kurt explained. "And you never mentioned her?" Katie asked, still incredulous. Kurt shook his head. "I ran into him about 10 years ago, and it never came up." I chimed in. "It's a long story. She had some commitments that kept them apart for quite a while." Katie smirked. "You make it sound like she was in prison." "Not quite," I replied, not eager to delve into the specifics. Thankfully, the waiter arrived to take our orders, diverting the conversation. When we resumed, it was strictly business. Katie's smile vanished. "So, what can K2 Executive Services do for you?" Kurt pulled out a notepad, ready to discuss business. "We need a long-term protective detail on a family." Kurt nodded thoughtfully. "How long-term? And what kind of detail are we talking about?" "A year, possibly more. Full package, drivers, panic buttons, armed escort. The father can handle himself, and the mother likely has federal backing, official or unofficial. Focus will be on securing the home and protecting their 3 children." "We'll need to recruit," Kurt mused. "I can deploy a 3-man team immediately, but we'll have to scale up to 6. This won't come cheap." Evie leaned forward, her gaze intense. Money isn't an issue here. Expand it to 12 men if necessary, 20, armored vehicles if it enhances security. Katie offered a reassuring smile, clearly accustomed to handling high-stakes requests. A 6-man team will cost nearly $800,000 annually, covering basic man-hours and overhead. Evie turned to me. Do you have your tablet? I handed it to her, ensuring we had access to Wi-Fi. She tapped away swiftly. Which bank do you use for transactions? And can they reach you on your cell? Katie provided the details. You should expect a call soon. Banks are closed, Kurt added, reminding us of the logistical challenge. For some things, banks are never closed. Katie shot Evie a skeptical look, one reserved for those who tread close to the edge of reason, just as the salads arrived. A few minutes later, Evie's phone rang. She conversed quietly before her expression darkened as she checked something on her smartphone. Who are you, and why shouldn't we be heading for the door right now? Katie's voice held a hint of concern. I'm a concerned grandmother. I need my grandchildren protected at all costs. Why us? You could afford Cass Global or Clark International. They might be better suited. But Ken trusts you. He assures me you can handle this. Katie seemed on the verge of stabbing me with her steak knife, her gaze flickering between Evie and her cell phone, likely checking their business bank balance. I retrieved my memo pad and opened it to a list I had prepared en route. Passing it to Kurt, I said, These are all former team members who owe me favors, the ones marked with red stars. Kurt scanned the list. Hollywood, Needles. He paused, then looked up at me skeptically. You sure about him? Did you see that eyesore of a camper outside? Seriously? The Deadhead Express? Kurt grinned, noticing Evie's tie-dye blouse for the first time. He still has that twisted sense of humor. Katie leaned over to inspect the list. That's quite a few favors, but with the amount your lady just deposited, we can make it worth their while. She turned to Evie. Do you have a personal banker who could call our bank president directly? No, I have a personal bank. I'm the only customer, Evie stated calmly. Actually, I own 5 banks, but I trust one more than the others. We went on to outline Emma's situation and the tactical details as thoroughly as we could, without divulging exactly how I had become involved. I suspected Katie noticed the omission, but the substantial sum Evie had transferred to her bank account seemed to assuage any doubts. How should we contact you if anything happens? Katie asked. I can't intervene directly, so it's for information only. Use PGP encryption. It should withstand most non-government hacks. Share it with Wendy and Pogo for the first month, then just Pogo, Evie instructed. Kurt nodded in understanding, but Katie appeared puzzled. Wendy? The what, Wendy? Yeah, she's a travel agent now. Met an Aussie pilot we used out of Asia and decided the army life wasn't for her anymore. They set up in discreet travel services. Katie caught the implication. So, all those rumors among us wives, we were wrong about her. I made it crystal clear to Wendy and the guys that none of that nonsense was tolerated in my unit, I interjected firmly. Katie glanced at Kurt. I never heard any of this. Would you have believed either of us? Kurt responded. She shook her head. Probably not. The conversation quieted after that, lingering only briefly on logistics before winding down. As we rose to depart, Katie flashed a slight smile at Evie. The money's great, but I know we should have a red star by our name in that book too. Those first years after starting the company were tough. She paused, glancing in my direction. Someone recommended us for a bunch of small, lucrative contracts early on, legal ones requiring discretion, protection, training. It gave us the chance to really take off and become something. Kurt shot me a slightly guilty look. I understood. Katie must have suspected something, and sooner or later, she would have connected the dots to me. Outside, I noticed Katie eyeing the camper with a disbelieving, amused grin, whispering something to her husband. They looked genuinely happy together. Let them. Just because my life didn't have a happily ever after didn't mean they couldn't have theirs. Nearly 3 weeks later, we reached the Grand Canyon. We'd meandered along the way, but the canyon was inevitable. It posed a risk, the kind my line of work usually avoids. Evie's insistence on visiting raised suspicions that she might have planned a rendezvous or check-in. If so, she had nothing substantive to report. Kurt and Katie were above board, legitimate, and heavily armed against anyone less official. If there was a plan in motion, it made sense to trigger it now. We arrived just before sunset on Christmas Eve. Alone at the rim, we stood in near silence, the cold breeze whispering around us, painting the sky in surreal hues. I felt her hand slip hesitantly into mine. "You won't need the revolver, or the .45. There's no one here. I just wanted to see it," she murmured softly, wistfully. I said nothing, absorbed in the changing colors and the darkening sky above us. She edged closer, seeking perhaps some shelter from the wind. Perhaps. I released her hand and drew her close, wrapping my arm around her to shield her from the wind. She settled against me, her arm slipping around my waist as we watched until the bright stars flooded the western sky. That night, bathed in the gentle flicker of our small Christmas tree, she faced me instead of turning away. "I'm tired of being lonely," she confessed. It was an admission tinged with affirmation, a deep-seated need for connection. Oh, maybe it was a touch of Stockholm Syndrome, though who it afflicted was uncertain now. There was an undeniable urgency, a hunger in her touch, yet it was smooth, familiar, two souls who had come to know each other deeply, perhaps more intimately than anyone else had known them in decades. The next morning, instead of parting quietly, we lingered. She nestled into my side, her leg entwined with mine, her hand resting gently on my chest, while I ran my fingers through her hair. She sighed softly. "I might just stay like this all morning." "I'm okay with that. Besides, it's cold, and our clothes are somewhere on the floor," I replied, feeling her smile against my chest, then sensed it fade. "Ken, I know this is temporary, and I'm about to ask for a lot, but can we just be us for now, just Kay and Libby, wandering the country, holding hands? And chasing each other around the bed, sleeping in late, sitting side by side, sharing dessert at restaurants." "One bowl of ice cream, 2 spoons," I suggested. "I've never had that. This already feels more real than my marriage," she admitted quietly. It was disconcerting, a mix of familiar gestures from my past with Tricia. Yet it felt different, not wrong, just different. It felt strange, almost surreal. Turning her down seemed needlessly cruel, and perhaps deep down I wanted it too. So I tousled her hair gently and kissed the top of her head, a reflex I hadn't used in a long time. "We can do that?" I said quietly. She trembled against me, and at first I thought it was from the cold, but then I felt the tears she was struggling to hold back. Uncertain of what to do or say, I simply held her in silence. It seemed to be the right thing because eventually she looked up at me with a weak smile, her eyes red-rimmed and glistening with unshed tears. "I'm sorry, I'm just being, I don't know, stupid," she said softly, sniffling a little. "No, not stupid. We're away from everything here. All the responsibilities you've been carrying, everything you've been protecting. It's in someone else's hands now. You don't have to be tough for anyone right now," I reassured her gently. She nodded and rested her head back on my chest, exhaling a long, slow breath. We stayed like that for hours, finding solace in each other's presence. Somewhere along the way, Evie had managed to procure a couple of bottles of wine and stashed them in the camper. We spent Christmas Day mostly in bed, simply enjoying each other's company. The following weeks were some of the best I'd experienced in a long while. We wandered aimlessly, stopping at quirky tourist spots, touring wineries endlessly. In many ways, it mirrored what we had done before Christmas, but this time there was no pretense. We were simply a couple. We held hands constantly, teased each other, and shared every dessert. 1 dish, 2 spoons. Reality only intruded when we made stops in various places to coordinate with Wendy. Our relaxed vacation mode pajamas were inevitably stowed away in a drawer until further notice. But all vacations must end eventually. So it was that on a desert back road in Southern California, overlooking a heat-baked landscape with sporadic patches of lush, irrigated farmland, we met with my trusted travel agent. 2 SUVs came into view, manned by 7 men and 1 woman, Wendy herself. I pulled the camper off the road and parked. Immediately, 4 of the men broke off from the vehicles, submachine guns discreetly emerging from under their jackets. They looked like Vityaz SNs, efficient Russian firearms, though I couldn't be sure of the exact variant. Evie watched them warily through the window. "So, what do we do now?" she asked, her tone edged with caution. I unloaded both handguns and placed them on the table under our small Christmas tree. I doubted anyone could compromise Wendy, but it never hurt to be cautious. "We move very slowly," I replied, opening the door with hands slightly raised. 2 of the men slipped past us into the camper, while the other 2 kept us covered. The rest of the team maintained vigilance around the perimeter. We stood patiently until the men signaled that the camper was cleared. The SUVs, I noticed, were clearly armored, their suspension slightly adjusted to handle the weight. Wendy caught my eye and gestured for us to approach. Evie reached out and took my hand as we moved forward, crunching on the dusty road. Wendy greeted us with a lopsided, wolfish smile as we reached her. "I don't normally do family vacations, Colonel, but for you, we'll make it work," she said, her voice tinged with wry amusement. I glanced at the Land Cruisers. Japanese SUVs, Russian guns. No love for American these days. Wendy chuckled. "The guns are heavily modified, likely part American-made, and the cruisers came cheap from our old contacts in Iraq. The U.S. government originally bought them. Shipping would normally be a killer, but we had some empty planes returning anyway." I nodded, impressed by her resourcefulness. Wendy had always been adept at finding practical solutions in unconventional circumstances. "Let's get moving then," I said, eager to begin the next phase of our journey under Wendy's capable guidance. I glanced back at Wendy's security team, concern etched across my face. "Wendy, what's going on here? This isn't discreet. Half a team, armored cars, and your security is focused outward," I remarked, trying to understand the situation. Her smile faded instantly. "Someone attempted to take out one of your principals. It didn't go as planned. Kurt sent me a package," Wendy replied solemnly. Evie's eyes widened in alarm. "Who?" "The husband. I don't have all the details. Kurt assured me everyone is safe." "There's another note addressed to you, Colonel," Wendy added, handing me a sealed package as we prepared to board one of the SUVs. It appeared secure, but I assumed Wendy had reviewed its contents. Smart move. Business was business. Evie struggled to contain her fury, her hands gripped tightly, nails digging into her palms. "That damn man. We've only been off the grid for 3 months," Evie seethed. I opened the package and sifted through its contents, summary reports from Kurt, and an anonymous report signed simply M. It didn't take a detective to guess M was Maria, a very James Bond touch. "They staged it like a road rage incident, used an SUV to force him off the road and tried to finish the job with handguns. Clearly a big mistake," I summarized, relaying what I read. Evie's jaw clenched, her expression darkening with every word. Evie's smile turned grim. "He was in his pickup truck?" "Someone shelled out big bucks for that," I replied. Her smile widened, almost showing fangs. "Kurt mentioned it's level IV plus armor. The extra weight made it much harder to push off the road than they anticipated." "And what happened then?" Evie asked eagerly. "Kurt's team was trailing him in a car, but they didn't need to intervene. When they attempted the attack, he ignored the gunfire, rammed them head-on into an overpass support. No survivors. Maria's people traced some of the funding back to a Reinhardt IG subsidiary." Emma's husband belonged to Cumulus Green, part of the Army's Cumulus program. While not the door-kicking types like my former unit, they were renowned for their training and pragmatism. As the saying went, scruples were currency in Russia, and morals were merely paintings on walls. Wendy struggled to suppress a smirk. It was clear she knew who Maria was, and found the situation amusing. Good grief, what a spectacle! When we're on the same page as the Phoebes, it must be doomsday, Wendy remarked, trying to maintain a nonchalant tone, but failing. The idea of being dragged into something wild still intrigued her, despite its potential business implications. Your part is just getting us to Fiji under the radar, but Maria might poke around a bit, so best avoid carrying any meds or anyone on their most wanted list for a while, I cautioned. Most of the guys on the most wanted list are already out of the country, and the rest can't afford a plane ticket. I keep tabs on that. As for pharmaceuticals, we haven't trafficked in anything but black market Viagra for a while. Need any of that? Wendy eyed Evie with a raised eyebrow. Consider it a complimentary service with your ticket. Evie met her gaze calmly. No, thank you. We've been managing just fine with cheap wine and a mutual case of Stockholm Syndrome. You kidnapped each other? Wendy quipped. It's a long story. Well, I'm glad you're getting along so well. You'll be sharing a shipping container for about 40 hours. A shipping container? Evie's expression soured. It's quite a nice one. Well lit, queen-size bed, even its own bathroom. All the comforts, Wendy assured us. Evie shot me a look that promised anything but boredom for the next 40 hours. Indeed, the shipping container turned out to be surprisingly comfortable, complete with a small wine cooler stocked with 16 bottles of very decent wine. As we passed under the sign that read, "Welcome to Fiji," our journey finally felt tangible. Upon arrival, we quietly navigated from the shipping terminal to the passenger terminal to clear customs. Our goal wasn't to evade customs, but to avoid using our real identities and sidestep the omnipresent airline security cameras susceptible to facial recognition hacks. Wendy's passports worked flawlessly, testament to her ticket man, and a slight against the Fijian Customs and Immigration Department. Mr. Ellis Banks and Mrs. Candace Toohey, according to the documents, had both passed away just 3 months earlier. Whoever Wendy's inside contact was, they had delayed the death notifications by several months. Just long enough for Evie and me to smoothly pass through Fiji, the delay in processing easily attributable to bureaucratic procedures. Evie slung her backpack over her shoulder with a bright smile as we cleared customs. So, Ellis, where are we headed next? We've got a bus to catch. It's a 4-hour ride to Suva. A bus? An actual vehicle? Air-conditioned and everything. Really? After our shipping crate adventure, I half expected us to be riding under a truckload of produce or chickens. A mischievous glint sparkled in her eye. Not that I'm complaining about the shipping container. Best international flight experience ever. Didn't get bored at all. The express bus arrived precisely on schedule and was only half full. We found a bench seat together, and she leaned comfortably against me during the journey. Evie's vengeful demeanor seemed momentarily suspended by our flight to Fiji, though I could still feel her simmering anger towards Reinhardt. She even relished our brief stop at Sigatoka Market, purchasing a large basket of fresh fruit and grabbing a paper bag filled with savory samosas. While Evie had visited Fiji before, her previous trips had been confined to private resorts. Now, she observed the small villages and coastline passing by with fascination, munching on a samosa and offering one to me. These are amazing. Surprised to find them here. I accepted with a nod. They make some of the best here. Indian laborers who came for the sugarcane also brought their culinary traditions. I must have missed that part in history class. I hesitated for a moment. Not to be blunt, but I doubt your schools paid much attention to the history of indentured servants. She scowled slightly and shifted to the far side of our seat, but remained silent for a moment. Then she replied, her voice tense yet fragile, I'm not completely oblivious to other people, Ken. I immediately felt remorseful. She had been making a genuine effort, mostly successful, to maintain normalcy. I know you're not, I said earnestly, trying to rectify my blunder. I'm not blaming you, Evie, and to be fair, the public school system doesn't exactly emphasize it either. We finished the rest of the samosas in silence. The vendor had shorted her 3, but we were both satisfied. By the time we arrived in Suva, she had leaned back against me again, as if drawn by weak gravity. After collecting our backpacks and the large basket of fruit, I steered her towards the harbor. It was a bit of a walk, but I preferred it over taking a cab and being recognized. The early afternoon sun cast shadows that seemed slightly out of sync with our movements. We had only covered a few hundred feet when a soft voice drifted from behind us. It was feminine but worn, the voice of someone who had witnessed too much of life's indifference. The kind of experience that leaves a permanent mark, regardless of what follows. "You're clear." The gentle tone was so unexpected that Evie didn't react at first. I quickly reached over and took her hand before she could turn around. "Look straight ahead and keep walking, Evie," I instructed calmly. "How long have you been following us?" "Since you cleared customs," came the reply. "And thanks for the samosas, I was starving." Damn, Pogo was right. Spooky was incredibly skilled. Evie didn't look back. "So, are you our guardian angel?" A soft, humorless laugh cut through the air. "Howard doesn't rub elbows with many angels, Princess. Only one I know of, and I'm definitely not her." She injected a mocking growl into the word princess. Spooky's disdain for the affluent ranged from seeing them as first against the wall when the revolution comes to potential emergency food supplies. Raised in foster care even before her white trailer trash drug addict parents did the world a favor and burned themselves up, Spooky's upbringing left a deep mark on her. Evie wisely chose not to engage further, perhaps sensing that crossing Spooky could escalate from taking snacks to something far more dangerous. And wise she was, Spooky had spent 14 years in the shadows of Cumulus' darker side, Red. They recruited from the fringes, easy girls, thugs, bookies, addicts, the unloved, the disposable, tasked with the unspeakable. Honey traps, extortion, and worse. Spooky not only survived, but thrived in that environment. "Where to, Spooky?" I interjected, redirecting the conversation. "Royal Suva Yacht Club. Greece has the Sea Angel docked there." A slight smirk tugged at the corner of Evie's mouth. "Needles, Spooky, Greece. Do any of your friends go by real names?" Before I could respond, Spooky's voice cut through, ice and razors wrapped in her words. "Spooky is my real name, Princess." It was true. I had signed as witness on her marriage certificate. From Spooky, no last name, to Spooky Godek, the name Pogo had given her had become her true identity. In the bureaucratic realm of the islands, her name mattered little as long as fees were paid. She held passports under multiple aliases, but none resonated with her like Spooky. I understood its significance. I had walked her down the aisle and assumed a fatherly role in her life over the past few years. Evie's posture stiffened, so I moved quickly to diffuse any tension. "Evie, it's a tradition in my line of work, and where we're headed used to be a smuggling hub. Plus, it's safer. Can you imagine how irrelevant most of what you've learned could be?" She walked alongside me quietly, gripping my hand tightly. "I suppose all they could prove is that I hired a small security firm to watch over my grandchildren." "Exactly." We continued in silence until Spooky sidled up to Evie. "Just head over to the 5th slip. Grease is waiting there. No one will be watching the boat." Evie glanced thoughtfully toward the slip, sensing the lack of room for error now. "How do you know?" Spooky gestured subtly toward an open-air shop where everyone's attention was fixed. "Angel and Danny are shopping, in bikinis." That explained it. Spooky drifted away as we quietly boarded the boat, slipping below deck to the salon with a nod to Grease, who was engrossed in inspecting something inside an access panel. We settled onto a plush couch together. Evie surveyed the surroundings. "A Viking?" "I'm not an expert, but Grease mentioned she's a 68. She ran her fingers lightly over the teak paneling. "Very nice. It's a charter fishing boat catering to the upscale crowd. Not exactly your scene, but they aspire to it." Evie looked about to respond when a slender, dark-haired woman in a forest green and plumeria flower bikini entered. Despite having had a baby just a year ago, she maintained a lean, athletic build from rigorous exercise, much like her father. She greeted me with a warm smile. "Uncle Howard, did you have a good trip?" More productive than I expected. So I see. You know, most people collect shot glasses or those kitschy little spoons as souvenirs, not hostages. Danny was always a bit of a smartass. Danny, this is Evelyn. Evelyn, this is Danny. Danny gave Evie a distant but polite nod and a slight smile, then turned to me. I thought you were going to eliminate her. I could see that Danny's casual remark caught Evie off guard. Plans changed, Danny. Not everything was what it seemed. She's an ally, not a hostage. Danny shrugged nonchalantly. I suppose we can always shoot her later. Shoot who? Came a melodic voice with a light Russian accent from the doorway. Even before I turned to look, Evie's widened eyes and Danny's smirk gave away that it was Angel. Danny gestured towards Evie. This is Evelyn. Alive? I glanced over at Angel and paused for the almost required 3 heartbeats. I'd seen her in every scenario, from pregnancy dresses to bloody shirts, but no one was immune. Golden hair, striking blue eyes, and beautiful pink lips. With smeared lipstick, must have been why Angel lagged behind. She couldn't just walk past Grease without kissing him, as if they'd been apart for years. Like Danny, it was nearly impossible to believe she had borne children, let alone 3. In Angel's case, it was probably some form of magic. I'd never seen her exercise at all, unless you count gleefully chasing her little girls on the beach. Evie managed to speak up. You must be the Angel the feisty girl was talking about. Angel just smiled. Evie turned to look at me. Just... How many people know you were planning on eliminating me? I thought back to the uncomfortable conversations I'd had before setting off. Explaining to my friends, my family, really, what I was doing and why. Nobody had questioned my decision to deal with Evelyn and Emma, or my desire for vengeance on the Reinhardt, just some concern over the potential reactions of the FBI and Cumulus Green. 9. It doesn't sound like you were keeping it very secret. Do they strike you as the talkative type? She scrutinized Danny and Angel critically. Not really. I needed their assistance, and if I had failed, I wanted them to know what was likely to happen. Danny settled into the chaise across from us. Information flows both ways. If something had happened to Howard, we would have demanded answers. Her voice sometimes sounded eerily like her mother's. Yet she was a daddy's girl through and through. Of Monster's 3 children, she was the most like him, just as relentless, calculating, and pragmatic as a machine when necessary. I gestured for Angel to join us. Evelyn, Evie, is here to assist me. She has her own reasons for taking down Reinhardt. So, she can grab all his money too? Spooky's voice came from behind the bar, where she was slicing up some of the fruit Evie and I had purchased. Her disdain was evident. Evie visibly wrestled with the choice between maintaining discretion and asserting herself. Sooner or later, her pride would win out. She wasn't accustomed to being spoken to this way, even if she suspected just how dangerous Spooky could be. With her pride and Spooky's volatile temperament, I doubted it would end well. She managed to rein herself in, at least this time. For my daughter and my grandchildren, they can burn every last dollar in Times Square for all I care. Spooky looked skeptical, but I could see that the idea of Evie protecting her family had given her pause. She had only become a mother a few months before I left, and it had hit her like a ton of bricks. I had witnessed her staring at her baby's face, then at Pogo, utterly bewildered by how her chaotic life had led to this strange moment. Evie sensed Spooky's hesitation. I'm not a monster, just a grandmother trying to do right by her family. Spooky shot her a scowl, but seemed somewhat appeased. Well, we already have a monster here anyway. Danny's smile widened slightly at the mention of her father. Angel, on the other hand, appeared indifferent to the entire exchange as she pulled out a couple of beach towels and some sunscreen from one of the lockers. The engine rumbled to life below us, its low hum barely audible, but enough to signal our departure. Angel beamed, almost blindingly. Time for us to go and cause some distractions. Danny smirked knowingly. We'll sunbathe topless on deck as we leave the harbor. They'll remember us, remember the boat, but they'll swear there were just 4 of us. She glanced at Spooky, who preemptively answered her unspoken question. Not my scene. They won't even notice me with you 2 up there. Spooky grabbed her plate of fruit. I'll see if Grease needs me to handle his radio or something. I observed them as they walked out. Angel was already untying her top. She wouldn't miss the chance to greet Grease with another kiss on her way to the deck, aiming for maximum impact while she had the excuse. Grease was indeed a fortunate man. Evie stared after them until they disappeared from view. So, what's her deal with me? Is she some kind of anarchist? She's not political at all. Probably never even heard of Chomsky, I replied. She just doesn't have much love for wealthy folks. Evie surveyed the luxurious yacht. Really? She seems pretty comfortable here. Grease and Angel weren't born into wealth. This boat is part of their fishing charter service, not some personal luxury liner. I wasn't inclined to delve into how Grease and Angel had acquired their wealth, especially given the official narrative that her supposed criminal husband had perished in a fishing accident in the deeps, conveniently omitting any mention of the 4 Russian mafia gunmen who had also disappeared that night. The official story had been bolstered by signed affidavits from respected business owners and the chief of police. She's fiercely loyal and protective of people she considers family. That includes you, doesn't it? Yeah, I think she sees me as something of an adoptive father. I certainly think of her as my daughter. Spooky had once confided, in a moment of drunken honesty, that I was the only father figure she had ever really known. Something akin to understanding and sorrow flickered across Evie's face, fleeting yet palpable. That explains some of it, she murmured, her voice soft with contemplation. But growing up in the system, that has its own effects. Her gaze fell to her feet, and she continued pensively. It's strange, not funny. At times, Emma probably wished she was an orphan, like Spooky. The way I treated Emma, I wonder if I hurt her as much as... Evie paused abruptly, her eyes lifting to the doorway where Spooky stood motionless, unreadable. As soon as Spooky and I made eye contact, she retreated silently, disappearing from view. I need to talk to her, I said, turning back to Evie. Evie nodded quickly, her eyes wide with surprise and concern. I found Spooky on the stern of the yacht. There weren't many places to hide on a vessel of this size. She looked at me with a mix of shock and vulnerability that caught me off guard. Your daughter? I asked gently. I did give you away at the wedding, didn't I? She replied, her voice wavering, betraying a rare glimpse of uncertainty. But that was a favor to Pogo, she countered quickly, almost desperately. Her usual stoicism seemed shaken, and fear flickered in her eyes, uncharacteristic for someone like Spooky, who was never afraid. How many people have you ever told why you like to grill on beach party Fridays? Spooky's voice cut through the air with a hint of playful challenge. I couldn't have been that drunk, I quipped back, laughing as I made a smacking motion with my right hand at butt level. Spooky's face flushed beet red, a reaction I hadn't expected. Another first. Spooky had been visiting Pogo regularly for almost a year before it happened. Initially, she had expected their relationship to be nothing more than a passing fling, a mutual attraction that would fade with time, and she was certain Pogo felt the same way. Then one night, when Pogo found himself short-handed, Spooky found herself manning the grill under the stars on the beach. As he shuttled food back and forth, Pogo lightly smacked her on the butt as he walked by. She shot him a look, and he responded with a grin. Can't pass my girl when she's cooking without smacking her on the ass. And just like that, everything changed. She realized that his words held more truth than all the expectations and self-deception they had both harbored. She was his girl, and he was all hers. The following year was one of quiet desperation as she wrestled with how to confess her feelings to him, grilling at every opportunity, while Pogo never missed that possessive little gesture. It all came to a head when she became pregnant, forcing them to confront their emotions head-on. Spooky reached out and lightly touched my fingertips with hers. For her, That gesture was akin to a full-on bear hug with rivers of tears. "So, is that my new stepmom?" she asked with grim humor. "We're comfortable allies," I replied diplomatically. "But you're tapping that, though, right?" Spooky added, her tone teasing. "Very ladylike, Spooky," I chuckled, shaking my head at her irreverence. She smiled, a Cheshire cat grin, hungry and dark. "You are. Seriously, you're pinning horns on the guy who sparked a genocidal war in Central Africa to raise oil prices by $1.37. 50,000 dead." "Hippolyte Charles," I acknowledged, surprised. "And since when did you—" "The only books Pogo has are military history books. They're all over the damn house," she retorted, attempting to appear annoyed, but failing, her smug satisfaction at catching me off guard shining through. She shifted uncomfortably and ran a hand through her hair. "This is going to get ugly, isn't it?" "For him," I confirmed. She gazed out over the waves. "I think Donna might know what's going on. At least some of it. And it wasn't me." "Probably Maria Hawthorne," I speculated. "The Triple B? The badass bitch of the bureau, the deputy director, supposed to be tough as nails." "Yeah, her. I'm on her radar. Must have slipped up somewhere." "We all make mistakes, but if she's aware, why aren't you behind bars?" "I think she's got a personal stake in this. She cares about Evelyn's daughter, Emma, the one she's trying to protect." Spooky raised an eyebrow. "Not in that way. I guess Evelyn wasn't the best mother. Her daughter hated her, and it seems Maria stepped in." "Well, we're a real merry band of misfits, aren't we? Fuck-ups, easy girls, sociopaths, obsessive murderers, and drunks. Damn, can't anyone just be normal anymore?" She actually smiled warmly at that thought, then shook her head with a wry expression. "Might as well beat the rush and pick up a Mother's Day card. She fits right in." By the time we returned to the salon, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting a warm glow through the yacht's windows. Soft, rustling sounds emanated from the enclosed bridge, where Angel had likely retreated as soon as we left the harbor. Her bikini bottoms lay neatly on the deck outside the helm door, which Spooky wordlessly hung on the latch. Inside, Evie and Danny were deep in conversation, their voices halting as we entered. Evie eyed us warily, tension evident in her posture. Spooky took a deep breath, breaking the silence. "All right, what's the plan?" Evie's jaw tightened, her anger towards the Reinhardt palpable, dark as iron. Money, pride, legacy. By the time we arrived at the islands, the rough outlines of the plan had taken shape. Grease and Angel's two older daughters bounded down the dock like bolts of golden-haired lightning, while their youngest rode triumphantly on the shoulders of a formidable figure, the monster. He jogged after Kisa and Lily with the lithe grace of a predator. The toddler clutching his hair on one side and his scarred neck on the other, giggling all the while. His clear gaze swept over us as we approached. His scrutiny lingered a fraction less on Spooky than before. Her status had slightly diminished on his threat radar since becoming a mother. But his focus settled briefly on Evie, assessing not if, but when he might need to confront her. As he sized us up, possibly even his own daughter, Danny surged ahead. She sought out eye contact with her father, eager yet composed, partly distracted by X and her young son, who had paused to investigate something along the beach. Meanwhile, Spooky remained close by my side, a habit she'd developed since our recent heart-to-heart. She knew her own son was right where he should be, with Pogo at the shack. Monster greeted us with a smile and a cheerful hello, a line that held no meaning for him beyond its social value in appearing approachable. X joined him, handing Danny her young son while eyeing Evie with a mix of curiosity and guardedness. "Alive?" X inquired, her tone carrying a hint of dry amusement. Evie rolled her eyes, a hint of exasperation in her voice. "I'm starting to wonder if it's more disturbing that everyone keeps asking me that, or that I'm getting used to it." X responded with a smile that, like Monster's greeting, seemed devoid of any real emotion. Sometimes I wondered if she, too, was a kind of monster in her own right. "Well, we can always just shoot you later," X quipped casually. Evie's gaze shifted between X and Danny. Your daughter's just like you. Danny chuckled. Oh, she's a bit of a blend of both of us. I fetched one of Grease and Angel's golf carts to take Evie back to my modest beach house. As we arrived, she took in the compact space with a reminiscent smile. It reminds me of the camper. Small, efficient. One bed, she remarked, dropping her backpack beside it. What do you think they'll do with our camper anyway? And your guns? Her tone held a touch of nostalgia. Wendy will put the camper in storage in case we... I need it again. The guns will be here soon enough. I've got more stashed around, I assured her. After a quick check to ensure the house was secure against the unpredictable tropical elements, I suggested lending a hand to Pogo for the beach party. It was nearing dinner time on Friday, and Greece's other charter boats had just returned, likely providing a busy scene down on the beach. We could already hear Jimmy Buffett's music drifting over the waves long before we reached the shack. Pogo greeted us on the beach with a nod towards Evie. This must be Evie? Evie sighed. Yes, alive. And yes, you can always shoot me later. Pogo chuckled. Obviously. I intervened. She's working with us on this, trying to protect her kid and grandkids from her husband. Spooks said you had a plan, Pogo remarked, glancing towards where Spooky had taken charge of the grill. Didn't get a chance to talk about it. We'll start working on it tomorrow, I assured him. Pogo turned to Evie, nodding. Yeah, I need to get back to running this party. Nice to meet you, and... If I have to shoot you, I'll make it quick, I promise. Evie tilted her head politely. Thank you. I'd appreciate that. With the beach party in full swing, I figured finding a table inside the shack would be easier, away from the bonfires and the grill. But as soon as we stepped inside, Danny and X intercepted us, whisking Evie away. It seemed Evie's attire, tie-dye blouse, love beads, and jeans, wasn't quite fitting for the Friday beach party theme. Shrugging, I headed back out to the grill to fetch a couple of plates of finger foods and waited for Evie's return. Hopefully, Danny wouldn't find an immediate reason to dislike her. While I was loading up the plates, I noticed Spooky jump as Pogo passed behind her. She shot him a glare, then caught my eye with a mischievous look before returning her attention to turning steaks. Evie reappeared wearing a silvery sarong and carrying a couple of bags. Apparently I was out of uniform, she said wryly. Sarongs are required on Fridays. Shorts and t-shirts are okay on other days, though sarongs are still preferred. Oddly enough, while tie-dye is forbidden, batik is perfectly fine, even encouraged. You could have told me about the dress code, you know. I chuckled. Welcome to Beach Party Fridays. I didn't know it applied to kidnap victims, Evie quipped dryly. I wonder if there's an etiquette guide for kidnap victims. That would be a huge help, I replied, trying to lighten the mood. I'd think it would be kind of hard to order while tied up in a basement, Evie said, glancing up over my shoulder. It is, came Spooky's voice from behind me. I turned to see Spooky standing there, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. You're not the first one to be kidnapped, Spooky continued. Mine sentenced me to purgatory for 12 years before I tracked him back down, and he planned to kill me at first, too. So, you were kidnapped and ravished by a pirate, too? Evie asked, her tone lighter. The actual kidnapping isn't much fun, but the ravishing is pretty good, Spooky replied with a hint of humor. It is, Evie agreed. They seemed to have reached some kind of truce, some understanding that I wasn't entirely privy to, but I was okay with that. Some things between them were better left unsaid, and I had enough sense to know I might not fully grasp it, even if they explained. As we walked back to the house, Evie nudged up against me. Apparently, one is not supposed to wear anything under the sarong. The next afternoon, we gathered for our council of war. Evie laid out the plan. Pogo leaned back, gazing up at the ceiling where a wicker fan spun lazily. You need to call Kurt. You're about to seriously piss this guy off. Get more security on the kids. Kurt's good, but you need to get him all the backup you can. Monster's head swiveled like a turret. He had been watching the children playing in the sand. He glanced at me briefly, but remained silent. X observed him from the corner of her eye, as she always did. She shifted uncomfortably. What are the odds he can track back to here? I considered for a moment. Low, Not zero, but very low. Kurt, Needles, and the others have no clue where we are. Only Wendy has any connection to Fiji, and I'll tell her to beef up security. Evie spoke up, concern etched on her face. Is there a way I can safely access the internet? I need to send more money to Katie. Pogo nodded thoughtfully. I have a couple of methods. It can be routed through Europe, and I have a satellite phone that can spoof its location. Have her call that. Pogo set up the connection, and within 30 minutes, the phone in my hand was ringing. Katie's voice was brisk. Talk to me. We just received enough money to hire an infantry brigade. I briefed her as thoroughly as possible on our situation. So, we need to prepare for an all-out war in Northern Virginia. How long are we talking about? Katie asked, her tone businesslike. This won't drag on forever. Give it 6 months, and we'll know if it's working or not. Our initial disappearance had been relatively benign in the European Society pages, where rumors speculated about Evelyn Cabot's escapades, possibly involving liaisons with ski instructors or other expected scandals among the elite. However, as the months passed, concerns started surfacing among various boards of directors. Their anxiety stemmed from the expiration of Evelyn's proxy votes, a strategic move she had used to protect herself from the Reinhardt. As these votes lapsed, significant blocks of shares remained unvoted, leading to growing uncertainty. Markets and financial institutions hate uncertainty, I began, watching Evelyn's expression darken as I continued. The Reinhardt is making moves to seize control of your votes, but the legal complexities are almost insurmountable. You've set up a labyrinth of legal obstacles to protect Emma and your grandchildren from his influence over the past few years. Evelyn nodded grimly, her jaw set. I've been directing my banker to send proxy authorizations and instructions that are causing significant damage to his financial maneuvers. Without my cooperation, he can't pull the same tricks to increase his wealth. He's furious, I added, losing staggering amounts of money and shares. His messages to your banker have been increasingly hostile, to say the least. He'll never face poverty, Evelyn muttered bitterly, but money is his currency of power. Losing it undermines his standing among his peers. Over time, it became clear to me that Evelyn had meticulously planned her financial moves well in advance. Despite their tangled finances, she was losing money and shares at a slower rate than the Reinhardt, which translated directly into retaining voting power. There's one particular company she's been eyeing, I continued, one that could deal him a severe blow. After 6 weeks of calculated financial strikes, Evelyn's patience was wearing thin. She turned to me, her eyes focused and determined as the sun rose over the horizon, casting an orange glow over the waves. Ken, we need to distract him. Spooky is pretty good with a camera, I remarked. Evie nodded once, her expression like a raptor spotting prey. And so we assembled our weapons, a beach chair, the ocean, and a camera. The photograph was clearly taken from a distance, likely from a tree. It captured a woman laughing, seated in a man's lap with her arms around his neck. She was unmistakably topless. A disreputable female paparazzi sold the picture, and an accompanying rumor to a third-rate European scandal sheet masquerading as journalism, for a sum far less than the Reinhardt would have paid to suppress it, had he known in time. The paper itself wouldn't survive the ensuing storm, but its loss was no great tragedy. The Reinhardt was publicly humiliated. The accompanying rumor hinted that his wife sought solace with someone less completely impotent. His messages through Evelyn's banker abruptly ceased as he scrambled to salvage his reputation. Soon, photos of him with young, attractive models and heiresses appeared in various society columns, but the rumors persisted beyond his control, despite the rapid and ignominious downfall of several newspapers. In his rage, the Reinhardt forgot a fundamental rule of magic. Distraction is key. While he fumed and tried to manage the fallout, the audience's attention had already shifted away from him, captivated instead by the allure of scandalous stories and sensational images. In this case, it was the girl in the skimpy suit who wielded the magic. Our journey took us via Air Wendy to Germany, a pleasant interlude amidst the chaos. Spooky, Danny, and Monster had already been there for a week by the time we arrived. We entered the small, old-fashioned boardroom just as the meeting commenced. I followed Evelyn, blending in as a nondescript bank employee. Evelyn Cabot strode into the room with an air of ownership, which, in a way, she did. Gentlemen, under Article 7, Section 3, extenuating circumstances necessitate a vote of confidence. A 15% loss in value over the last 6 weeks qualifies. The director seemed taken aback by her assertiveness. That would be highly irregular. Yes, it is, but it is within the bounds of the law. Not all board members are present. Unnecessary, we have a quorum. In the end, the vote unfolded precisely as Evelyn had orchestrated. After all, she held the proxies for 3 of the absent board members. One board member, upon realizing his predicament, hastily packed his belongings. Spooky had unearthed evidence linking him to his ex-wife's unfortunate demise. The other 2 absentee members had less lethal but equally compelling reasons for supporting Evelyn with their proxies. The 4th missing board member had been a staunch supporter of the Reinhardt. He had also indulged in abhorrent practices involving underage individuals, believing his privilege shielded him. He wasn't scrambling to pack. He never would. Danny's maternal instincts had seen to a more direct resolution in his case. He had just turned 48 when he was extracted from his penthouse apartment by Danny and her father, but by afternoon's end he appeared much, much older. Monster likely saw no practical value in tormenting a man who had nothing useful to divulge and whose fate was sealed. Yet he indulged his daughter's wishes. The company itself wasn't among the Reinhardt's largest holdings or most profitable ventures. In fact, its financial significance barely registered on his expansive portfolio scales. However, its symbolic impact was profound. Founded during the tumultuous 30 Years' War nearly 4 centuries ago, Reinhard Pulverhoff originally supplied gunpowder to mercenary armies across Europe. Over time, it transitioned to specialize in military and industrial explosives. But its true importance lay in an obscure but crucial regulation. The CEO of Reinhard Pulverhoff also held the directorship of Reinhard IG, a massive transnational conglomerate of far-reaching influence. Now, Evelyn Cabot assumed both roles, the CEO of Reinhard Pulverhoff and the director of Reinhard IG. My radio crackled to life abruptly, breaking the silence. Control, this is Alpha. Tango, 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 Sector 3, over. Alpha, this is Control. Go ahead. Over. 8 tangos in Sector 3, standard 2x2 formation moving towards Point Blue. Over. Roger Alpha. I have them on visual. Break, break. All kilo elements. All kilo elements. Stand by for contact. Over. There was a tense silence as I observed the dark figures darting toward the stables. They moved with practiced efficiency, but not with the precision of our team. Their mistake was hugging the stone walls too closely, a risky move as bullets tend to ricochet along stone surfaces due to physics. Their likely plan was to regroup for a final assault from that direction, suggesting additional support elements were advancing on the opposite side. Before I could relay a warning over the net, another voice, older and authoritative, cut in. All kilo elements. This is Sandman. 4 personnel moving to Point Green. Over. Sandman, this is Control. Good copy. Do you need assistance? Over. Negative. Kilo Control. Fish in a barrel. Over. There was a grim humor in Sandman's voice as he emphasized the designation Kilo, distinguishing himself as an outsider. Joint operations always came with their challenges. The firefight that ensued lasted just under 53 seconds. Our team executed flawlessly. While we were prepared for close quarters combat if necessary, it wasn't required. Katie would be pleased. Despite her outward confidence, I knew she worried about my safety every time. Not that I was directly involved. I monitored the entire operation from the basement via video surveillance. My mp3 rested nearby, but realistically the odds of them breaching our defenses were virtually non-existent. Sandman dispatched all 4 targets at Point Green with chilling precision. He neutralized 2 members of the entry team before they even realized they were under attack. The remaining assailants attempted to retreat, but we had already sealed off their escape route. All elements reported back. No survivors. They had conspired to kill a family with 3 children for a substantial sum of money, so I felt no remorse for them. As the old saying goes among gamblers, you roll the dice, you take your chances. The only audible sounds beyond our immediate vicinity were the 6 shots from the heavy sniper rifles. The local sheriff would likely chalk it up to miners using illegal fireworks, unaware of the lethal confrontation that had just taken place nearby. While the observation posts maintained their vigilance, the team swiftly loaded the bodies into a couple of delivery vans we had prepared. Needles had a car crusher on standby, which would prove useful. Ironically, while the intended targets, the husband and wife, remained in the heavily armed basement library, their children had been whisked away days earlier. An armored van, arranged by the grandmother, had come for them. According to Katie's intel, the driver, Patrick, and his partner Finn had a striking resemblance to their father, self-assured and hyper-aware. Where they were taking the children remained a mystery, but crossing paths with them would undoubtedly be regrettable, if only for a fleeting moment. Sandman entered the scene. Michael Sanders, known as Sandman in operations, was Maria Hawthorne's partner. Officially, he was supposedly on vacation in Florida, supposedly hunting alligators. That was the official story, at least. They had tipped us off about the hit team. Judging from the circumstances, they likely skirted some legal lines to gather the information. I handed him a sanitized copy of the video. No audio, no identifiable faces. Along with it, he took anything found on the bodies that might assist in identifying the hit team. I suspected there wouldn't be much usable information. They were likely of Russian or Eastern European origin, possibly ex-special operations. A common profile in the current market. Not my problem, really. I keyed the scrambled phone. Katie? Yes, all wrapped up. 12 in total. Love you too, babe. The Alpine Lodge lacked curtains, opting for pricey window polarization, a fitting detail for my target's lavish taste. Through my optics, despite the polarization, I had a clear view of him. He sat at his ancient desk, refusing to look at the breathtaking view of the snow-covered mountains. Frustration rippled through his gestures, his inability to accept what had transpired evident even from afar. Even with the distance and the thick high-tech window, I sensed his seething fury at losing his wealth, his pride, and his legacy. His desperation and disgust were palpable. I waited patiently as he reached for the red-edged folder containing critical information. His expression shifted to bewilderment as he opened it and stared blankly at 2 photos that began to darken ominously under the light, soon becoming unrecoverable black sheets. The heavy rifle fired, and I absorbed the recoil, the shot catching me by surprise. Good shots always do. 1,000 meters away, a distance that ensured the round would penetrate the glass without much deviation. Still absorbed in the darkening photos of Tricia and Gabby, he didn't see it coming. The custom armor-piercing round punched through the supposedly bulletproof glass, striking him squarely in the sniper's triangle, just above the aortic arch. I watched him slump in his chair, his mouth gaping in spasms for a few moments. With a final glance, I slung my rifle over my shoulder and began the long trek down to where I had parked the car. Somewhere, in the recesses of my mind, Gabby's laughter echoed, distant yet clear and beautiful. Tricia's smile lingered in memory. Pogo brought a bottle of black rum to the table and settled into the chair beside mine. Donna eyed the bottle knowingly, a slight smile playing on her lips. Maria seemed less enthusiastic, but too polite to decline. Mike, gazing up at the shack sign above the bar, chuckled softly, shaking his head. Maria, curious, asked him, "What's amusing you?" "They just put up the name of the unit," Mike replied with a grin. Confusion clouded Maria's expression. "What name?" When they worked with you, they used 16th Training and Readiness Group and a dozen others, Mike explained, but originally they were Mac V. SOG's 5th Hunter-Killer Detachment in Vietnam. Maria's puzzlement deepened, and Donna's interest piqued. I sighed, preparing to recount the unit's peculiar tradition. In 1972, I began recalling the tale, an NVA mortar attack destroyed the sign for the 5th Hunter-Killer Detachment. Bugs, the unit clerk— Pothead bugs, Pogo interjected, prompting a nod from me. He painted a new sign, way out of regs, with those funky balloon letters from the 70s. The 5 looked like an S, so the whole thing read SHK. Maria's confusion gave way to amusement as she processed the quirky history. So, SHK stuck ever since? Yep, Pogo confirmed with a grin. Just part of the unit's colorful legacy. Mike chuckled. Heard that one from Jorge at the academy. He lived in your world for a bit. You know how CIA agents call their headquarters the company, and NSA agents call NSA the building. These guys? They always call their headquarters the shack, I finished for him. Donna's eyes fixed on the sign. She didn't comment, but her expression hinted at her dismay over the blatant breach of operational secrecy. Hey, we're retired, Pogo interjected casually. Donna turned to me, her tone serious. I hope not completely. I shrugged noncommittally. It was best not to make promises. Maria glanced at Mike. Someone has to handle the tough jobs. Sometimes legal avenues aren't enough. Perhaps it was time to delete that video of Maria eliminating the Chinese official. Pogo shot me a meaningful look. I surveyed the bar, contemplating the eclectic, unconventional family we'd formed over the years. Fuck-ups, easy girls, sociopaths, obsessive murderers, and drunks. Spooky's words echoed in my mind. Maybe we could make a difference. 6 months later, Evie returned. I lounged in a beach chair, enjoying the ocean breeze and the swooping gulls when she approached, clad in a silvery sarong. She settled onto my lap with a quiet sigh of contentment. I'm tired of being lonely, Ken, she murmured softly. How long are you back for? 3 months, Evie replied softly, her gaze distant yet hopeful. I gave her a reassuring pat on the hip. I was hoping you'd join me at the farm for 3 months, then back here for 3, and repeat. Emma's family might even visit occasionally, I suggested, caught off guard by the idea. Evie paused, considering. As for the company, it's in a blind trust for now. I conducted an audit and uncovered some irregularities. I stepped aside and made some calls. Investigators from 6 countries are dismantling Reinhardt IG as we speak, she explained with a satisfied smile. It will take years to complete, and the conglomerate will never be the same. And then? I asked, curious. How does Emma feel about all this? She sighed again, her voice tinged with uncertainty. I'm not sure, but hopefully buying this time will help me figure it out. At least she doesn't seem angry with me anymore. It's a start, I agreed, drawing her closer as we settled into a comfortable silence. Maybe we can dust off the camper and take another trip. I have a guide to Yosemite, I suggested, trying to lighten the mood. Another road trip for Ken and Libby? Evie mused with a smile. Or 2 or 3, I replied, chuckling softly, though I do have some commitments here, on and off. Maria hinted at that, Evie remarked knowingly, her tone gentle and understanding. As we watched the vibrant hues of red and orange fade into the darkness of the night sky, we finally stirred from our beach chairs and began heading towards the shack. Ken, I have a serious question, Evie said as we walked. Yes? I replied, curious about her thoughts. I looked into your background after Maria warned me. You have a comfortable, normal retirement for a colonel. A decent portfolio and solid investments. But with all the travel, the firearms, everything else, where does the money come from? I hesitated for a moment, then decided to be honest with her. We took down a drug lord, and I found a Cayman bank account number and password among his belongings. No one else recognized it. It's not your typical source of income, but it's substantial. Ah, that makes sense. I remember you had a background in finance, she acknowledged, processing the information. As we reached the door of the shack, Evie stopped me with a thoughtful expression. "One more thing," she started, her voice serious. "What is it?" I asked, curious now. "When I walked in here earlier, I swear I heard Spooky call me Mom," she confessed, her tone a mix of surprise and wonder.